The history of modern warfare is not merely written in the blood of soldiers or the ink of treaties, but in the molten iron and tempered steel of the Ruhr Valley, where for 400 years, a single name became synonymous with the industrial soul of Germany and the terrifying machinery of death. To understand the Krupp family is to look into the very forge of the modern world, witnessing a lineage that transformed a modest hardware business in Essen into a global monolith capable of toppling empires and dictating the terms of global conflict. This is not just a chronicle of wealth and engineering. It is a dark, sprawling epic of ambition, madness, and a cold, unyielding devotion to the production of steel that would eventually arm the Kaiser's ambitions and fuel the horrific furnace of the Third Reich. The story begins long before the thunder of the Big Bertha guns, in the narrow, cobblestone streets of 16th-century Essen, where Arndt Krupp first established the family as merchants of significance during the Black Death, proving even then that the Krupps possessed a unique, almost predatory instinct for surviving amidst catastrophe. By the early 19th century, the family's destiny was irrevocably altered by Friedrich Krupp, a man possessed by the spectral promise of English cast steel, a secret process that the British guarded with the same intensity as a crown jewel. Friedrich's life was a tragic testament to the price of obsession, as he spent his entire fortune and his failing health trying to replicate the purity of the high-quality crucible steel required for precision tools and machinery. He lived in a small, humble cottage on the grounds of his factory, a structure that would later be preserved by his descendants as a sacred shrine to the Krupp work ethic, while he battled bankruptcy and the mockery of his peers. When Friedrich died in 1826, he left behind a failing firm, a mountain of debt, and a 14-year-old son named Alfred who inherited nothing but his father's unfinished dream and an iron-willed mother, Therese, who refused to let the forge go cold. Alfred Krupp, the man who would become known as the Cannon King, did not merely save the company. He reinvented the very concept of the industrialist, blending visionary engineering with a paternalistic, almost feudal control over his workforce. He understood that the future lay not in scythes or files, but in the burgeoning railway networks and the inevitable modernization of artillery. The breakthrough came with the seamless railway tire, a marvel of metallurgy that allowed trains to travel faster and safer, symbolized by the 3 interlocking rings that remain the company's logo to this day. Yet, Alfred's gaze was always fixed on the potential of steel to dominate the battlefield. At the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, while other nations showcased textiles and art, Krupp stunned the world with a 6-pounder field gun made entirely of cast steel, a weapon that rendered the traditional bronze cannons of the era instantly obsolete. This transition from railway merchant to international arms dealer was fueled by Alfred's eccentric and increasingly reclusive personality. He was a man who lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, terrified of illness and drafts, eventually constructing the Villa Hügel, a massive, 269-room limestone palace that felt more like a fortress or a mausoleum than a home. It was here, in this cold, imposing structure overlooking the Ruhr, that Alfred orchestrated the arming of Prussia. His steel cannons became the decisive factor in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, where the superior range and reliability of Krupp's breech-loading guns decimated the French forces at Sedan. This victory did not just unify Germany. It cemented the blood and iron pact between the Krupp family and the German state, creating a symbiotic relationship where the family's private profit was inseparable from the nation's military might. As the 19th century waned, Alfred's son, Friedrich Alfred Krupp, inherited an empire that had become a state within a state, a city of steel where thousands of workers lived in Krupp-built houses, shopped in Krupp-owned stores, and were buried in Krupp-funded cemeteries, all while the factory chimneys of Essen continuously blackened the sky, preparing for a new century of unprecedented slaughter. The dawn of the 20th century saw the Krupp Empire reach a pinnacle of influence that few private entities in history have ever mirrored, yet this era of supreme dominance was shrouded in the personal scandals and psychological fragility of Friedrich Alfred Krupp, known as Fritz. Unlike his father, the iron-willed Alfred, Fritz was a man of delicate sensibilities and scientific curiosity, more interested in marine biology and the azure waters of Capri than the soot-choked air of Essen. However, the burden of the Cannon King title was inescapable. Under his tenure, the firm expanded its reach into the naval arms race, fueling the maritime rivalry between Kaiser Wilhelm II and the British Empire. Krupp's armor plating and massive naval guns became the skeleton and teeth of the German high seas fleet, turning the family into the primary architect of a global powder keg. Yet, this public triumph was mirrored by a private tragedy that would shock the foundations of the German elite. In 1902, rumors of Fritz's private life and his escapades on the island of Capri were leaked to the press, leading to a scandal that culminated in his sudden and mysterious death, officially recorded as a stroke, though many whispered of suicide. The sudden vacuum of leadership left the empire in the hands of his eldest daughter, Bertha Krupp, a young woman who would become the namesake for the most terrifying weapon of the coming Great War. Because the Prussian tradition could not conceive of a woman running an arms monolith, Kaiser Wilhelm II himself intervened in the family's personal affairs, handpicking a husband for Bertha, the career diplomat Gustav von Bohlen und Halbach. Upon their marriage, the Kaiser granted Gustav the extraordinary right to prefix his name with Krupp, ensuring that the lineage, at least in name, remained unbroken. Gustav, a man of rigid bureaucracy and cold efficiency, adopted the Krupp identity with a fanaticism that surpassed even the family members by blood. He transformed the firm into a highly disciplined machine, perfectly synchronized with the German General Staff's secret plans for a preemptive strike across Europe. As 1914 approached, the Krupp factories in Essen became the forge of Germany, operating at a feverish, around-the-clock pace. When the First World War finally ignited, the world witnessed the terrifying debut of Krupp's technological mastery, the Big Bertha howitzers. These 420mm monsters, named sardonically after the heiress herself, were capable of firing shells weighing nearly a ton, designed specifically to shatter the impenetrable Belgian forts at Liege and Namur. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The mere sound of a Krupp shell was said to drive men to madness. But the family's ultimate engineering feat was the Paris gun, a long-range railway cannon that achieved the unthinkable by firing shells into the stratosphere to strike the French capital from over 75 miles away. For 4 years, the Krupp name was the literal engine of the German war effort, producing everything from U-boat engines to the steel helmets worn by the millions of youths dying in the trenches. By 1918, however, the roar of the furnaces was silenced by the sting of defeat. The Treaty of Versailles specifically targeted the nest of vipers in Essen, forbidding Krupp from ever manufacturing weapons of war again. Inspectors from the Allied commissions roamed the factory floors, overseeing the destruction of specialized machinery and the dismantling of the great cannons. To the outside world, it appeared the Krupp empire had been declawed, forced to pivot to the mundane production of agricultural tractors, cinema projectors, and cash registers. But beneath this facade of civilian industry, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach remained a staunch nationalist who viewed the Weimar Republic with contempt. In the shadows of the Ruhr, the firm began a clandestine program of rearmament in disguise, shifting research and development to dummy companies in the Netherlands and Sweden, and hiding blueprints for new tanks and artillery in secret vaults. The empire was not dead, it was merely hibernating, waiting for a leader who would provide the spark to reignite the furnaces and restore Germany's, and Krupp's, martial glory. The fragile peace of the Weimar years was, for the Krupp family, a period of silent preparation and simmering resentment. As the Great Depression clawed at the throat of the global economy, the industrial heart of Essen began to beat in sync with a new, radical rhythm emerging from Munich. Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, initially a man of aristocratic disdain for the upstart Adolf Hitler, soon recognized that the National Socialist platform of total rearmament and the tearing up of the Versailles Treaty was the only path to restoring the family's former glory. By 1933, the conversion was complete. The Cannon King became a fervent supporter of the Third Reich. The symbiosis between the Krupp Empire and the Nazi state was not merely a business arrangement. It was a total ideological alignment known as the Adolf Hitler Spende, a fund to which Krupp was a primary contributor, ensuring the party's financial stability in exchange for the total militarization of German society. As Hitler consolidated power, the Krupp factories were transformed into the armory of the Reich. The deception of the previous decade evaporated, replaced by an overt and frenzied production of the most sophisticated weaponry the world had ever seen. It was during this era that the family's engineering prowess reached its most terrifying and megalomaniacal heights. Under the direct orders of the Führer, Krupp engineers designed the Schwerer Gustav, the largest rifled weapon in human history. This 800mm railway gun, a behemoth weighing 1,350 tons, was a physical manifestation of the Krupp ego, a weapon so massive it required its own double-track railway and a battalion of thousands of men to operate and defend it. It was a throwback to the siege warfare of the past, yet built with the cold precision of modern physics, capable of firing 7-ton shells that could penetrate even the deepest concrete fortifications. However, the dark expansion of the Krupp Empire during World War II carried a price far more horrific than mere financial investment. As the German Wehrmacht swept across Europe, the demand for steel and shells outpaced the available German workforce. In response, the Krupp firm, now increasingly under the influence of Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the eldest son who had been groomed from birth to take the mantle, entered into a grotesque partnership with the SS. The family that had once prided itself on the paternalistic care of its Kruppeiner workers now turned to the systematic exploitation of slave labor. The Krupp factories became a sprawling network of misery, utilizing tens of thousands of forced laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp inmates dragged from the horrors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald. The moral abyss into which the family descended was nowhere more evident than in the Berthawerk factory in occupied Poland and the various workshops scattered near the camps. Here, the Krupp name was no longer associated with industrial innovation but with the destruction through labor policy. Men and women, starved and beaten, were forced to forge the very steel that would continue the war that had enslaved them. Alfred Krupp, now the sole owner of the firm thanks to the Lex Krupp, a special decree signed by Hitler that bypassed inheritance laws to keep the empire intact, monitored the production quotas with a chilling detachment. He walked through the factories, seeing not human beings, but units of production that were discarded once they were too weak to hold a hammer. This was the ultimate evolution of the Krupp dynasty, an empire built on the fusion of high-grade steel and human suffering, arming a regime that intended to rule for 1,000 years. As the Allied ring tightened around the crumbling Third Reich, the sky over Essen turned into a permanent shroud of fire and ash. The Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces, recognizing that the Krupp works were the very heart of the German war machine, unleashed a rain of high explosives that finally shattered the forge of Germany. By 1945, the sprawling industrial city that Alfred and his ancestors had built was a skeletal wasteland of twisted girders and cold furnaces. In the final days of the war, Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach sat in the opulent silence of the Villa Hügel, watching from his hilltop vantage point as the American 17th Airborne Division rolled into the Ruhr. On April 11, 1945, the Cannon King was arrested not as a defeated businessman, but as a primary architect of the Holocaust and a war criminal who had profited from the blood of Europe. The subsequent legal proceedings at Nuremberg, specifically the Krupp case, stripped away the family's aristocratic veneer to reveal the grim mechanics of their empire. Unlike his father, Gustav, who was deemed too senile to stand trial, Alfred faced the tribunal with a mask of icy indifference that unsettled even the most hardened prosecutors. The evidence presented was damning: internal memos discussing the disposal of exhausted slave laborers, photographs of emaciated prisoners working in Krupp-branded workshops, and the undeniable paper trail of the Lex Krupp. In 1948, Alfred was sentenced to 12 years in prison and the forfeiture of all his property. It was the first time in 4 centuries that a Krupp did not own the land beneath the Essen factories. For a brief moment in history, it appeared that the dark steel empire had finally been extinguished, its name consigned to the same infamy as the regime it had armed. However, the shifting tides of the Cold War provided a miraculous and controversial resurrection for the family. As the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, the United States desperately needed a strong, industrial West Germany to serve as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. In 1951, John J. McCloy, the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, issued a stunning grant of clemency. Alfred Krupp was released from Landsberg prison after serving only a fraction of his sentence, and in a move that outraged survivors of the slave labor camps, his vast fortune and industrial holdings were restored to him. The Cannon King returned to Essen not in shame, but in a chauffeured Mercedes, greeted by a cheering crowd of loyal workers who still viewed the Krupp family as their paternal protectors. The post-war economic miracle of West Germany was built on the back of the restored Krupp conglomerate. Alfred, realizing that the world would no longer tolerate a private family manufacturing weapons of mass destruction, pivoted the firm toward the infrastructure of peace. Krupp Steel began to bridge the great rivers of the world, build the hulls of massive oil tankers, and construct the chemical plants that fueled the global boom. Yet, the ghost of the past remained. Alfred lived a lonely, monastic life in a small wing of the Villa Hügel, refusing to occupy the grand state rooms of his ancestors. He had become a symbol of a Germany that wanted to forget, a man who worked obsessively to rebuild his company's wealth while remaining utterly silent about the moral debt he owed to those who had died in his service. The empire was back, but the soul of the family had become as cold and impenetrable as the steel they produced. The final act of the Krupp dynasty began not with a roar of artillery, but with the quiet realization that the age of the industrial patriarch had reached its end. Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, the man who had survived the ruins of the Third Reich and the cells of Landsberg to rebuild his empire, found himself facing a crisis that no amount of steel could solve: the lack of a successor who shared his cold, singular devotion to the firm. His only son, Arndt, was a product of a different era, a man of jet-set society, arts, and leisure who possessed no desire to carry the heavy, blood-stained mantle of the Cannon King. In 1967, facing massive debts in a changing global market that favored corporations over family dynasties, Alfred made a monumental decision that would forever alter the family's legacy. He agreed to transform the Krupp firm into a public foundation, the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Foundation, effectively ending 4 centuries of direct family ownership. Just weeks after signing the documents, Alfred died in Essen, marking the symbolic death of the old Prussian industrial order. Arndt von Bohlen und Halbach, in an act that many saw as a final repudiation of his ancestors' dark history, formally waived his inheritance rights to the company. In exchange for a generous annual pension, he gave up the Krupp name and the control of the factories, choosing to spend his life in the sun-drenched villas of Marrakesh and Palm Beach rather than the gloomy halls of Villa Hügel. With his death in 1986, the direct lineage of the Essen Krupps came to an end. The empire, however, lived on, merging in 1999 with its longtime rival, Thyssen, to create ThyssenKrupp AG. This new corporate titan became a global leader in high-tech engineering, elevators, and industrial services, carefully scrubbing the Cannon King image from its corporate identity and replacing it with a commitment to transparency and social responsibility. Today, the Krupp legacy is a haunting presence that looms over the Ruhr Valley and the conscience of modern Germany. The Villa Hügel, once the nerve center of an arms empire that dictated the course of 2 world wars, is now a museum and a cultural venue, its vast, dark-paneled rooms open to the public who walk where Kaisers and dictators once plotted conquest. The interlocking rings of the Krupp logo still appear on steel girders and machinery across the globe, but they serve as a reminder of a terrifying paradox: that the same family responsible for the most brilliant engineering marvels of the industrial age was also responsible for some of the darkest chapters of human exploitation and destruction. The story of the Krupp family is the story of the 20th century itself, a relentless pursuit of progress fueled by an uncompromising ambition that, when left unchecked by morality, turned the tools of civilization into the instruments of apocalypse. As the fires of the Essen furnaces have cooled and the soot has been washed from the city's walls, the Krupp saga remains a definitive case study in the banality of evil within industry. It is a narrative of how a single family's quest for metallurgical perfection became inextricably linked to the machinery of total war, proving that steel is never just metal, it carries the weight of the intentions of those who forge it. The transition of the Krupp works from a merchant's shop to a global arms monolith, and finally to a philanthropic foundation, mirrors Germany's own long, painful journey of reckoning with its past. The dark steel empire is gone, but the echoes of its cannons still vibrate through the halls of history, a permanent warning of the price paid when industrial might is divorced from human conscience. Quote,